The Group Chief Executive Officer of NNPC, Mele, yesterday at the interactive session organized by the Senate Committee probing sabotage in the oil and gas sector, chaired by Senate Leader Okpeyemi Bamidele, declared that the leadership of the NNPCL are neither thieves nor economic saboteurs. He stressed that the NNPCL is loyal and faithful to the country, adding that its management vowed to protect the interests of Nigeria in the petroleum industry. He observed that most problems in the petroleum industry have nothing to do with NNPCL. Meanwhile, the management of Dangote Refinery has denied acknowledging that the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited has supplied 60% of 50 million barrels of crude oil it lifted. A statement from Dangote Group spokesperson Anthony Chijina explained that the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRC, had failed to ensure that Dangote Refinery received its complete crude requirement from the NNPC and international oil companies. It says NNPCL has only allocated 6 out of the refinery's 15 cargo requirements for September, and it was compelled to purchase Nigeria's crude from international traders at additional $3 to $4 million per cargo. Joining us now, as we take a look at an in-depth look, I should say, at the NNPCL and Dangote face-off and many solutions to the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, is Kevin Emmanuel, energy expert, co-founder and CEO of Dairy Hills. Great to have you, Kevin. Is truly the NNPC loyal?
Good morning, Rufai.
Good to see you. Is truly the NNPC loyal, as Mele Kyari said? Like I was saying to Ayo, it's August already, August 9th.
Yeah.
Mele Kyari says we'll start pumping out fuel out of Port Harcourt Refinery. It's August 9th already. We're waiting for the fresh fuel from the Port Harcourt Refinery. We shaved off about close to $2 billion to fix. Where is the fuel from that refinery? Where is that refined crude? So are they truly loyal?
Well, you know, Rufai, I've said it over time that I do not trust. I'm only going to believe the NNPC on the Port Harcourt Refinery or any other government-owned refinery when I see the actual derivatives in trucks going out of the Port Harcourt Refinery gates. That's when I'm going to believe, when the marketers confirm that they've actually started and that trucks have started coming out with products. That's the only time I'm going to believe them. Because, you know, if you look at the fact that over the last 20 years, about 12 trillion naira has gone down the drain in turnaround maintenance, and there's nothing to show for it. And you look at the exchange rate at which that 12 trillion naira was expended, is nearly equivalent to $20 billion, which is the same thing that Dangote used in building one of the largest refineries in the world.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Kelvin. I want you to just put to, you know, during his introduction, Rufai had talked about this whole back and forth between the NNPC and Dangote Refinery with regards to the 60% or 50 million crude. What's happening there? What is going on there? Because if they're saying they're supplying and Dangote is saying they are not receiving, then there's something not quite right. What's your take on this?
Ayo, good morning. Thank you so much.
Morning.
So, you know, there is what is called the Domestic Crude Oil Supply Obligation, Sections 109 of the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. And based on Sections 109, the NUPRC, which is the regulator for upstream, released a gazette on how domestic crude oil supply obligations is supposed to work between the licensees and leasees or production companies upstream and the crude oil refinery license holders. So now the question is, based on DCSO guidelines, are they obeying DCSO guidelines? Because based on production regulation guideline in sections 11 and 12, it says that the MNMDPRA has the responsibility to actually take a note of the refineries, how much they are producing, how much in crude oil shortfall they have, and send that note to NUPRC. And if there's a shortfall for any refinery in Nigeria, for example, and you see the only active functional refinery in Nigeria is Dangote, and I'll tell you why. Because the modular refineries cannot produce PMS. You know, modular refineries do what they call primary refining. They don't have what they call catalytic reformer that helps you to do secondary refinery to convert naphtha, which is the base compound you use in producing PMS, into PMS. And, you know, for modular refineries that are anywhere between $50 and $70 million to construct between 7 and 10,000 barrels refining capacity per day, a catalytic reformer will cost you anywhere between $25 and $30 million. So far, it's only one company in Nigeria, Aradel, that is making an attempt to install a catalytic reformer for secondary refining of petroleum to convert naphtha into PMS. So the only active refinery in Nigeria that can actually refine naphtha compound into PMS is Dangote Refinery. So the question now is that, for example, in the month of September, the allocation is supposed to be 15 cargoes. Now, in trading, there's what they call large crude carriers, very large crude carriers, VLCCs, and ultra large crude carriers. So for large crude carriers, for example, which is what you have come to Dangote, you have anywhere between 120 and 150,000 deadweight tons, which is equivalent to about 1 million barrels. So you're talking about 15 million barrels of crude oil for the month of September, for example, that will take them at about 500,000 barrels per day, or anywhere around 65 to 68% capacity utilization. They've only delivered 6 cargoes out of 15. So it means that based on DCSO, they owe Dangote Refinery 9 cargoes for production in September of 2024. And based on sections 11 and 12 of the production regulation guidelines under DCSO, it says that if there is a shortfall, NUPRC is supposed to put out what they call a request for quotes, RFQ, to the production lessees upstream to put up that shortfall unless the government is not going to give them export permits to take crude oil out of Nigeria. It's the law. So if Dangote is saying that, listen, the NUPRC is actually not enforcing domestic crude oil supply obligations, and the gazette it produced based on DCSO, it is completely within the law. It's not saying anything that's extraordinary. It's not asking for special favors.
Okay, now, given this foundation that you've laid out so eloquently, there is news that NNPC intends to borrow another $2 billion, which would be oil-backed. Now, this, of course, is juxtaposed to the fact that domestic crude oil sales to local refineries will be done in Naira. How does it all balance in the end?
Well, you know, I am not a fan of reserve-based lending. $2 billion that the NNPC is looking at raising for 35,000 barrels per day in a wholesale agreement to go to an international trader who is a collector for the banks to a debt service reserve account offshore that is not subject to any oversight or appropriation in Nigeria, because reserve-based lending typically favors middlemen and it favors the creditors. And also because you've had a situation where there's a value trade mismatch when it comes to reserve-based lending. You know, you could see that if you look at the history of NNPCL, between 2019 and 2024, it borrowed $12 billion through reserve-based lending, including the last $3.4 billion that was taken structured through Afrexim that it contributed about 40% of, you know. And you also consider the fact that when it comes to reserve-based lending, there's typically what they call the secured overnight financing rate of 6%, which is the global standard for international USD loans. Then there is a country risk premium in addition. And you could see that for the last loan that was collected, the country risk premium was 5.85%, which brought the effective interest rate to 11.85%. Now, for this loan, Nigeria has a risk premium of anywhere between 4 and 5%. So it means that Nigeria is going to be paying anywhere between 10 and 11% on a USD loan, which is very high, double digits. So, you know, it doesn't make sense that in 2024, you know, NNPC needs money for capex, needs money to, you know, invest in its operations upstream, NEPL, MPDC, to increase maybe its production on a daily basis from 150,000 barrels up, and it's having to borrow money. The question is based on the PIA, where it says that every crude oil that is sold, 70% goes to Federation account, 20% goes to NNPC as retained earnings. What has NNPC done with its retained earnings that it doesn't have $2 billion to be able to invest in capex to increase production upstream? That's the question we should ask. And this is the reason why, for example, you don't have enough crude oil feedstock to supply the domestic refineries in Nigeria. All barrels of crude oil around the world, 88 million barrels that is produced on a daily basis for the whole production globally, 32 million barrels for OPEC members globally, yeah? It goes to refineries. They refine the crude. So if they refine the crude and we have one of the largest commercial refineries in the world, how come we don't have a strategy that ensures that we supply and we guarantee security of supply to one of the largest commercial refineries in the world? And it's interesting. It's interesting, Vimba. I'll tell you why it's interesting. A lot of people think that when it comes to crude oil refining into derivatives, the only major products you have is PMS, automotive gasoline, oil, Jet A1, and kerosene. No, it's not. There are so many other derivatives. For example, you actually get what they call bitumen binders, which if you mix it with sand, produces asphalt, which you need for your road construction. Road construction in Nigeria is so expensive. It's one of the highest in the world because we import bitumen binders. You also have petroleum coke. Petroleum coke is used for aluminum cans, and it's one of the reasons why the cost of your sweetened sugar beverages has actually gone up. So there's so much in the supply chain for refining crude oil into derivatives that is going to profit Nigeria just beyond PMS and diesel and Jet A1 that airplanes fly on. So, it's important for the Nigerian government to adjust its strategy to ensure that it can guarantee supply to Dangote Refinery. The Dangote Refinery should be classified as a critical national asset.
Okay, Kevin, couple of things. First, please take us through the madness that is going on in this country, where NNPC, that's supposed to be a money printer, is now a money borrowing machine for Nigeria, hedging with our crude. When you see the likes of Saudi Aramco making a lot of money, you can't just understand why the NNPC is hemorrhaging cash, making losses. Secondly, by my estimation, this catalytic converter that will convert naphtha, because I know we have a couple of, modular refineries, like the likes of OPAC and Walter Smith and a couple of other refineries. This catalytic converter obviously is less than $100 million. Correct me if I'm wrong. Haven't we envisaged a place?
Yes, it's like...
It's less than $100 million, right? Haven't we envisaged a scenario?
It is less than $100 million.
Haven't we envisaged a scenario where NNPC can take equity in these modular refineries by providing for them these catalytic reformers to be able to reform to PMS and give them the crude? Because people like OPAC, I know Refinery has been down for a while. They don't even get the crude to buy Naira from them in the first place. Rather than taking it abroad and refining it and buying it with the currency arbitrage and everything that goes on. So why has NNPC not thought of just buying those catalytic reformers for this modular refinery so that they can have more output and plus also support Dangote so that we can produce everything in situ? Why is this level of madness going on?
I'll walk you back memory lane a little bit, and I'll bring you back to where we are today. In 2008, PPMC, former defunct PPMC, created what they call the Oil Processing Agreement (OPA), and it called for a situation where it brought in, it issued tenders to companies. 35 companies applied for the tender, 13 qualified for it, including the likes of Sonoco, Petrobras, the likes of SIR, that Sahara Energy has a stake in. And, you had a situation, for example, where crude oil was given to foreign refineries and then in exchange for PMS and, guarantee for diesel and then Jet A1 when the government was still subsidizing diesel prices before it deregulated it fully, And, you had a situation where, for example, you remember what the price of PMS and Jet A1 was then.
Yeah.
But then over time, PPMC ran into debt, Jonathan left, and then Buhari came as president. They decided to adopt direct sale, direct purchase, and they were exchanging about 320,000 barrels of crude oil in exchange for PMS, and I think there were about 16 companies that qualified for that tender then. DSDP ran to up all the way until 2023, I think, and then it was stopped. So you today you have a situation where Nigeria is no longer a country without a functioning refinery. Nigeria has a functioning refinery. Now, the question is, does it make sense, business sense, to invest in the modular refineries and ensure that they have catalytic reformers, which only 4 companies globally, by the way, has license to sell, so that they can do secondary refining for naphtha, which is the base compound, into PMS? Well, it might make sense, but now the question you want to ask is, if we already have a functional refinery that can do up to 650,000 barrels processing capacity and can produce up to 49.4 million liters of PMS daily, why are we not supplying it feedstock? That's the question we should ask Rufai. What's the problem? So when you look at, the amount of production that is done upstream on a daily basis, they say now is 1.6 million, 1.65 million. I say that number is not correct because you also have
that number
condensates.
plus condensate?
Condensates will take you anywhere. Yes, that number is inclusive of condensate. So effectively, you have anywhere between 1.4
and OPEC doesn't count
1.45 million barrels per day.
And OPEC does not even count condensate.
OPEC doesn't count condensates. They don't count condensates. Plus, you also have, that crude oil is divided into royalty oil, tax oil, and cost oil. Not all of it belongs to NNPC.
How much?
So the question
can I ask
you want
this
to ask
quickly,
is,
Kevin, how much is the net oil out of the 1.4 minus condensate that belongs to NNPC? How much is the net oil after royalties?
I'll put it at 700. I'll put it at 700,000 barrels per day that belongs to NNPC in terms of royalty and tax oil. That's where I'll put it.
All right.
So from that royalty and tax oil, there's supposed to be like a portion of it that goes into the DCSO, domestic crude oil supply obligations. The question we need to ask ourselves, okay, maybe you can raise that 700,000 to around 800,000 barrels per day. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why is the allocation that goes to DCSO not coming to the refineries that are functioning? The question we need to ask ourselves, Refi, is since this year DSDP, direct sale, direct purchase, has ended, why is some of this crude oil feedstock actually sold at a discount to the open market rates under DCSO? And who is it sold to? This is the question we need to ask ourselves. Why is Dangote Refinery, which is the only functional refinery that has the ability to process any grade of crude oil because of its Nelson Complex Index, NCI, not getting the feedstock it needs to be able to refine and supply the markets in Nigeria? And the risk is this. I'll tell you what the risk is. If, for example, for the month of September, it's gotten 6 cargoes, it's owed 9 cargoes, it's not gotten 9 cargoes. Dangote is spending at 450,000 barrels per day. They're spending anywhere between $960 million a year on crude oil feedstock. If it has to import feedstock, the business case will make absolute sense for it to also export its derivatives to other countries and not bring it to Nigeria. Nigeria will lose out on 2 things. To lose out on security of supply, to also lose out on possible FX revenues from net export proceeds. It needs to stabilize its FX market at such a critical time as this. All
right. Thank you very much for pointing that out. An important point or questions you raise. I'm actually going to throw some of those questions back to you because that was what I was going to pose it to you. One of the things that the Dangote Refinery Group have come out to say is that, as you mentioned, the NNPCL should abide by the PIA, which makes provision for domestic supply of crude. However, the NNPCL could argue, even though they've said, or some people would argue, that there's no crude. Where are they going to find the crude to even meet their domestic obligations? And also put that side-by-side revenue for the NNPCL itself in terms of FX revenues, bearing in mind that if they sell to Dangote, they're going to sell in Naira denominations. How do we balance that? Because number one is the crude. Where's the crude? Number two is for FX being able to make money in FX for NNPCL. The argument for them would be that if they sold to Dangote in terms of the remaining crude that they have, then it would be in Naira, which is not bringing FX to them. How would you balance that?
Okay, I'll tell you how. It's a very excellent question you asked, how you balance it. Just yesterday, the central bank settled T+2, for example, for retail Dutch auction system, where it goes directly to the customers who are applying, of about $876 million. I am of the opinion that for you to sustain the progress in the FX market, and for Naira to continue to appreciate, you need anywhere around $1.2 billion a month to intervene in the market. So how do you balance a situation where the FX revenue that's supposed to come to government to help CBN to settle its balance of payment, considering that your net external reserves are less than your balance of payments for 1 year, is not altered at Dangote putting up payment guarantees and paying for crude oil feedstock in Naira. So if you say to Dangote, look, I'm going to give you crude oil feedstock, and based on the law, because the PIA says that you can either pay in US dollar or Naira. It didn't say specifically that you must pay in Naira. Based on the law, if you give royalty oil to Dangote, and he produces, and you say this particular percentage, maybe 40% of the derivatives, the non-transportation fuels and some of the transportation fuels, after satisfying the demands of the local markets, are exported. And you tell him that because we're selling to you in Naira, you have to bring back your net export proceeds back to Nigeria to help the CBN to do balance of payments. He'll be happy to do that. Okay? But if you don't provide him feedstock and he has to go source his FX and import crude oil, the US dollar that he should have brought back to Nigeria as net export proceeds, he's going to use it to settle his balance, do reconciliation for the importation in US dollar that he does. This is the trade-off that Nigeria needs to do. So if you supply him feedstock, and this is considering that at full capacity utilization, that refinery has the potential to generate up to 28 billion US dollars a year. So if, for example, you're bringing back even 35% or 40% of that, you're going to exceed the demands of the balance of payments that the CBN is required to do on a yearly basis, which in my estimate is around $7 billion a year. Currently, our net external reserves is lower than $7 billion a year. So the trade-off is good. If you give him in Naira and mandates that at least 40% of whatever he produces and he exports comes back to Nigeria, you're going to have more than the FX that you get for him buying feedstock in Naira to settle your balance of payment obligations in Nigeria. This is the way I want us to look at this conversation. Yeah. So it's not saying that, oh, if you sell to him in Naira, you won't have FX to be able to do your balance of payment obligation. There's a way to go around it.
Yeah.
All right. Now, very quickly, the issue of Malta is still hanging because it hasn't been explained, dissected. There's a sudden peak in the product being imported from Malta. Now, given your understanding of what's going on, what's your assessment? How does this relate to all that's going on with NNPC?
I watched the interview. Where the regulators, and the NNPC says that they're loyal to Nigeria, and made all kinds of statements, and said that they've not done anything wrong. Well, I'm not accusing anybody, but I'm saying let the facts speak for themselves. So, for example, the representatives of the Comptroller General of the Customs, he made a very interesting observation that I don't think a lot of people noticed. He said in his opening remarks on behalf of the Nigerian Customs Service that the customs is not included in the fiscalization of the NUPRC. Fiscalization is an electronic process for monitoring and validation of transactions that are mostly sales for the purposes of tax compliance and government oversight. Yeah? Why is NCS not included in the fiscalization for NUPRC? Number one point. Number 2 point, he said that based on their obligation, they are supposed to patrol 24 nautical miles to prevent anti-smuggling. And he also said, on record, that the Nigerian Customs Service most times does not have the logistics to patrol 24 nautical miles. So is there a case of smuggling of substandard petroleum products in Nigeria? That's the first question we should ask. Number 2, does the regulator, NMDPRA, do they have a standard laboratory that can test for research octane number, multi-octane number, that can test for density, that can test for sulfur, yeah, that can test for distillation level? The answer to that question is no, they don't have it. So if we bring in forensic auditors to audit the certificates that are issued to companies that are bringing in products into Nigeria, will it check out? Bear in mind, for example, that early this year, the central bank brought in Deloitte as a forensic auditor to audit $6.8 billion in forwards that are requested by banks on behalf of their customers. And they found out that $2.4 billion were not valid because they didn't follow the proper process of documentation. And they refused to pay $2.4 billion of forwards. If we bring in forensic auditors, the question is, the certificates that are issued to these companies who bring in products in violation of ECOWAS framework and in violation of the standards for sulfur level and research octane number, will it check out? That's the question we should ask.
I mean, and that's a big question. And your guess is as good as mine on that question. It might not check out because NNPC has not still explained to us the verification process through the lab that they went through when 2 years ago, 2022, they brought in substandard fuel into this country in a batch that was knocking engines of people. That case has not been settled till date. God in heaven only knows the part per millions of sulfur that was in that batch of products that came into the country? I know you want to sound off more on that. But another thing, this NNPC is supposed to be...
Rufai. Okay.
Go ahead before I land my question. Go ahead.
No, Rufai, the evidence shows that for diesel, for example, two of the companies had research sulfur level at 2,631 parts per million and 1,829 parts per million. Dangote Refinery sulfur level is now below 30 parts per million, and the target is 10 parts per million. This is evidence. This is empirical evidence. Okay, and I'll tell you.
So are you also saying that
Farouk
doesn't have a lab to check this before he indicted Dangote? Is that what you're saying? Because some other people too have started pushing the narrative.
Rufai, I'm not aware. I'm not aware that the NMDPRA has a standard lab that meets up with global certification standards for gasoline testing. And the most respected gasoline testing method is what they call the American Society for Testing and Materials.
Okay.
Yeah, D4814. That's the most globally accepted standard for testing gasoline. I'm not aware that the NNPC has a standard lab for testing gasoline in Nigeria.
Okay,
I'm not aware.
I want to ask this.
And I was going to mention to you that one of the biggest problems we have as a country is a lack of consequences for action. And anytime there's a lack of consequence for action, it sends a precedent to other people that you can do something more sinister in a bigger way, and you can always get away with it.
Very good. And that's why I do not know why we didn't have class action suits against the NNPC then, because they themselves came out to admit that the batch they brought in was bad. People's cars were affected. Nothing happened. So obviously, I'm not sure the NMDPRA then did test that particular batch that came in. This was in, I think, about 2 years ago now. It's going to 2 years ago now that incident happened, and nothing happened. It was just swept under the carpet. This NNPC, let's talk about their books. What are their financial reports like? And secondly, when are they going to be listed on the NGX? Because if you say you're running a private company, there should be some level of accountability. We've seen Saudi Aramco list in America and some other markets. When are we going to have that level of accountability with the NNPC? And really, I'll ask you this. Do you think it's time for us to have a management change in the NNPC?
Okay, so Rufai, I'll tell you that if you look at the PIA, you look at the fact that the president is the one right now who actually appoints the board of NNPC and the management, who is in charge of the management of NNPC. It's my view, for example, that for NNPC to succeed, there needs to be a Chinese wall between the villa, presidential villa, and NNPC towers. You cannot have a company succeed by you having memos and phone calls, give instructions and have it work. I honestly think that the only way, and if you look at NPI, is very clear. It says that Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated and Ministry of Finance Incorporated are supposed to become beneficial owners, nominee shareholders of NNPCL. It's my view that even the other oil and gas companies that NNPC is holding the stake of the federal government of Nigeria in, like West African Gas Pipeline Company that is owns about 24.9%, NLNG that is owns 49%, those should be transferred to the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated. And the asset manager, which is MOPI and MOFI, should start the process after the act that establishes them is amended, for example, to send NNPC to the equity capital markets to raise money. And this is the better solution to the question Vimbai asked about NNPC raising $2 billion. If it makes sense for NNPC to be raising $2 billion, when it should be the one giving the federal government money in such a dire period that we are in. The only process that is going to ensure there's accountability in NNPC that is going to increase internal controls and raise corporate governance standards in the organization and ensure that there's a Chinese wall of little intervention or no interference between the government and the company so that the company can run efficiently is if the company is taken to an IPO. The IPO process is going to alter and change who has powers to nominate a board who has powers to appoint a management team. It's going to reflect realities of the market more than it will reflect the nepotism of federal character and government appointments. And I honestly think that it's time for Mr. President, to take the bull by the horn and realize that 50% of the macroeconomic problems that this country has comes from NNPC. In 2015, Rufai, Nigeria migrated from revenue to debt. And they moved from CBN getting about $3 billion monthly in terms of FX to do balance of payment settlement, which was what enabled Sanusi then to be able to peg Naira within a 30 Naira band. Yes?
Okay.
They moved to debt, to borrowing money. If you don't take NNPC to the public to raise money to be able to change its corporate governance structure and also fund upstream operations and increase the amount of crude oil that you drill upstream and make it more of an operator, you're going to keep having the cycle we're in, and we're going to keep being this macroeconomic problem that we're currently locked up in.
All right, Kelvin, thank you so much. It's been such an insightful time with you. But before we go, just very quickly, some people might think, okay, why are we just looking at NNPCL? We have IOCs who could potentially give crude to Dangote Refinery. Why can't they explore that option? I know there's something around, commitments, pre-production commitments. I'd like you to just break that down for us this morning, if you can, in 1 minute.
Well, the PIA is very clear. Production and regulation guideline that was issued by NUPRC is very clear. If there's a shortfall in what domestic crude oil refineries in Nigeria needs, the NUPRC has an obligation by law to issue a request for quotes to the production lessees and licensees upstream to ensure that they meet up with that shortfall. Else, the government will not give them an export permit to export their products, regardless of the commitments they have, prior commitments they have. This is the law. It's just for the NUPRC to enforce the law. It's the law.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So it's the law. Energy security, NNPCL has an obligation, according to the PIA, to provide, to ensure domestic supply, at least to modular refineries and to, of course, refineries like Dangote Refinery. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's only that NUPRC will now tell you that it must be on willing buyer, willing seller basis.